Hey, everybody. Russia, they say, has already agreed, in principle at least, to a ceasefire with Ukraine. Is that true? Well, we're going to talk about it right now on the Hot Zone. So thank you for watching. I'm Chuck Holton. I'm coming to you from my studio here in Panama. And I am kind of interested watching the way that the media is reporting what's going on as the Trump administration attempts to broker some sort of ceasefire, an end to the killing in Ukraine. And this is something, obviously, it's been going on for 3 years. It's been going on actually a lot longer than that. Russia is making noises like they would be open to some sort of ceasefire. But the real question is, what do they mean when they say ceasefire? And can they even afford to agree to a ceasefire of any kind? And would they actually do so? I mean, can Russia be trusted to keep its word? So I'm going to start out by giving you a little history lesson, since yesterday's podcast was very popular. A lot of people liked the getting a better understanding of the backdrop to the current crisis in Syria. You can go back and watch that on yesterday's podcast. But I want to give you a similar backdrop to the crisis in Ukraine. Now, I'm going to try to stay away today from making pronouncements or judgments on whether or not the United States ought to be involved, whether or not Ukraine is corrupt, or anything like that. I'm going to focus more on the history that Russia has with its neighbors and talk to you a little bit about, help you understand more about this conflict by understanding the context in which the conflict takes place. Now, first of all, you have to go all the way back. You can go to the Holodomor in 1932 and 33, before the Holocaust. You could go back much further than that, because there have been many times throughout history when the Ukrainians and the Russians have been at each other's throats, have been at war. Poland even took over Moscow one time for an entire year. This is, hundreds of years ago. But suffice it to say, there's been conflict in that region for a long time. The Russians have never been known as especially peaceable people. That kind of goes without saying, especially now. But if we look at the Holodomor and explain that in 1932 and 33, the Soviets, which was, so you understand, the Soviet Union was Russia and about 14 other countries that it took over around Russia to form a buffer zone around its country. So the Soviet Union was much more synonymous with Russia than it was with Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia, Kazakhstan, Armenia, Poland, all these other countries that were behind the Iron Curtain. The Soviet Union was an attempt by Russia to make itself safer by just taking over all of its neighbors. And there's a very good argument to be made that President Putin is attempting to create the Soviet reunion by doing the same thing now, extending his power over his neighbors, especially since, from a conventional war standpoint, Russian borders are not very defensible, and they would need to push out all the way into like the Fulva Gap and some of these other areas along the Carpathian Mountains and stuff in order to have better defenses or better defensible positions in case of a shooting war with lots of tanks and stuff. I think we're figuring out in Ukraine that tank warfare is dead, or at least all but dead, and the whole world has changed. So that argument that Russia needs to take Ukraine in order to have more defensible land borders is sort of moot at this point. They really don't, because of the nature of war anymore. Now, so in 1932 and 33, the Soviet Union under Joseph Stalin uh, basically decided Stalin decided, I want to show the Western world that communism is better than capitalism, that we can produce everything they can produce and more. And it was a real pride thing on his part, that the Soviet Union must show how great it is by outproducing uh, the rest of the world agriculturally. And so he put just unrealistic, very, very high quotas on the farms in the breadbasket of Europe, which is Ukraine, mostly in the Donbass region. When the people couldn't produce that much grain, then he said, well, it must be just because they're lazy or corrupt. And so he sent troops in there to make it harder for them. He took away their uh, private farms and sent them more to collective farms. And he needed a scapegoat. So he, true to form, with what many politicians do, he started to pit the classes against each other, the poor against the rich. And in that case, a rich person was called a kulak, kulak. Um, and it was basically anybody that had a cow, had more than one cow. Well, those rich kulaks, they just make all their money off the backs of all the poor people. And they would put out statements in the press like, if your kulak neighbor has more than you do, then you have every right to go take what he has. And if you have to kill him to do it, so be it. So they were just fostering this hatred among the classes to the point where people started to do that. They did go and start killing their neighbors and taking their stuff. It's the same thing we saw in the Armenian genocide in 1918 to 1922. And as that went on, the output actually, I mean, not surprisingly, dropped even more. Stalin got angry and sent more troops down there and said, you know what, if those people are going to be so lazy they don't get to eat. And so he took away their food. And they sent teams of people around to steal the food from the Ukrainians, take all their food away, anything that could be eaten, taken away. They had made special rods that they would push into the walls of their homes to make sure they weren't hiding grain in the walls of their homes. And as a result, something like 4.5 million people starved to death over that winter of 1932 and 33. It's horrific. But think how long ago that was. So that was 80, 90 years ago. Up until very recently, and even, I mean, there may be a few left today, but up until just in our lifetime, for sure, if you lived in Ukraine, you would have known people who had survived the Holodomor, who told you about, told you the stories about how brutal and horrific the Russians were when they came in and, started to just destroy everything in that region. Well, the following spring, there wasn't enough people left to actually plant the new grain to start over. And so what Stalin did was he moved in people from other parts of Russia, Eastern Russia and places like that, moved them in there, forcibly relocated them to the Donbass to repopulate those farms and plant the grain. The reason why most people in the Donbass to this day still speak Russian instead of Ukrainian is because the Ukrainians were all killed off and they moved in Russian-speaking people to take their place. Now, that doesn't necessarily equate to those current day people who live there want to be Russian. They speak Russian as their language, but they don't identify anymore, by and large, with Russia culturally. They believe themselves to be Ukrainians. I was there three weeks before the war started, traveling all throughout the Donbass, talking to many, many people. And except for some some older people and a few drunks that I talked to, everybody I talked to said, we're Ukrainian. Yes, we speak Russian. Of course, we still have family in Russia. We know our heritage comes from Russia, but we're Ukrainian and we don't want to be part of Russia. Well, if any of them did want to be part of Russia, they certainly don't anymore because of the brutality that Russia has visited on the Donbass in the last 3 years. So, cheese on top says Soviets were harsher than the Nazis to Poland in World War II. Yeah, every bit as harsh. There is a grave in Brovary, right outside of Kyiv, that I've been to. There's a forest out there that has the remains, mass graves of something like 50,000 Poles that were shipped out there and buried during the Soviet Union times. Anybody else who was in the least bit considered to be an intellectual, if they thought you were a little too smart, they would murder you and your family or ship you off to a labor camp in the Gulag or something like that. And that kind of just pure evil, really. I mean, the fact that that was a generally accepted thing to do in Russia back up until, well, yesterday, even today. Those kinds of things are still being done in Russia. And that's why many people say that Russia is it's a mafia state. It's not a country so much as it is, as one of our former senators said, that it's a gas station with nukes. It's a kleptocracy. Now, I'm going to fast forward a little bit and talk to you about some of the war crimes and aggressions that Russia has visited on its neighbors in more recent history. Starting in we'll start in, about the turn of the century, 1999, 2000. The wars in Chechnya, Russia moved into Chechnya, did to Chechnya what it has done to the Donbass. They bombed indiscriminately residential areas of Grozny, which led to thousands of civilian deaths. They systematically tortured people, and there were tons of extrajudicial killings. There were, disappearances. If you got on sideways with the government in any way, shape, or form, you and your family would just disappear. And they have found quite a few mass graves in Chechnya since that war, which went on for 10 years. That wasn't just a short conflict. It went on for a long time. In 2008, before they had even finished the war in Chechnya, they started another war in Georgia, targeting civilians in two northern provinces of Georgia, South Ossetia and Abkhazia. Those two states to this day are being occupied by Russian forces. They're inside Georgia, the country of Georgia, but they are annexed, for lack of a better term, by Russia, just like they have done to parts of Ukraine. Throughout those areas, there are all kinds of accounts, videos, stories, documentaries that talk about the ethnic cleansing that has taken place in those two forlorn states in Georgia. As it turns out, any place that Russia occupies, they start to cleanse that area. Like I say, they have no problem disappearing people, sending them off to camps, re-educating them, quote unquote, usually with 3 shots to the back of the head. And that ethnic cleansing is a recurrent theme throughout the history of Russian aggression. Now, in 2014, Russia annexed Crimea. Now, this is agreed upon in writing by Russia when Ukraine got its independence from Russia, when the Soviet Union fell in 1991, 1992. Russia agreed in writing with Ukraine that Crimea belonged to Ukraine. It was in writing. And in 2014, Russian-backed separatists, just moved in there and started killing the people of Crimea. The Tartars live there. It's a people group. It was a Ukrainian people group, ancient people group. And Russia didn't like that people group, so they started massacring the Crimean Tartars. And this was just a few years ago, 10 years ago, 11 years ago, something like that. Of course, free speech, not a thing. Free press, not a thing. Freedom of religion, not so much. You have complete freedom of religion as long as you worship in an approved way. You have freedom of speech as long as you don't say anything that you shouldn't think. I mean, this is how it works in a totalitarian state. In 2014, also, Russian-backed separatists moved in. They called them Little Green Men. This was so two disparate groups of people here. You have the Little Green Men, which were actual Russian soldiers in sterile uniforms that moved into the Donbass region and started whipping up support for annexing the Donbass. Now, why did they want to annex the Donbass region? Well, it didn't have anything to do with the fact that there are Russian-speaking people that live there, as popular opinion has tried to make out. It had a whole lot more to do with the fact that since about 2008, there have been 39 trillion cubic meters of natural gas that have been discovered in the Donbass region. That's enough natural gas to give the rest of Russia a pretty good run for its money in terms of supplying natural gas to Western Europe. Russia didn't want that because 40% of their budget, their government budget, came from natural gas. So they wanted to take the Donbass. In order to do that, they did what they always do. They employed Soviet military tactics and techniques and procedures, which was to move in artillery, heavy artillery, and start bombing civilian areas until they were powder, and then move in your troops. They began forcibly conscripting the people who lived in the Donbass to fight against their family, their own countrymen. And if you don't, it's like, okay, you're going to join our army and we'll kill your family. I mean, or we'll kill your family. Maybe both. But all this aggression didn't just take place in the areas surrounding Russia. It's not like, well, I hear some people on social media trying to make the point that, well, of course, I mean, the United States wouldn't put up with unfriendly neighbors. They wouldn't put up with Mexico joining the BRICS or something like that. Well, look, if you live in a neighborhood and somebody comes in and buys the house next to you, and they start having wild parties and they make a lot of noise at night and they paint their house this garish color and let trash lay all around all over their yard, you have every right to be upset about that. You have every right to complain, call the police, take legal action if necessary to try to put a stop to that. Appeal to the homeowners association or whatever you have to try to get that nuisance taken care of and dealt with. What you don't get to do is go next door and set your neighbor's house on fire, as much as that might be satisfying thing to do. You don't get to go next door and murder your neighbor. And this is essentially what Russia has been doing with its neighbors all along. And so to try to make the case that Russia has a right to aggress against people who are not threatening Russia, Ukraine was not threatening Russia. Abkhazia and South Ossetia were not they were not a threat to Russia. Moldova today, tiny little country, that's not a threat to Russia at all. But yet Russia has aggressed against all of those countries. And if you really feel the need to make a case that Russia is justified in any of those things, you should take a real hard, long look at your own sense of morality, because it is patently immoral to murder people, whether or not they belong in your own country, whether or not you agree with them, to just send your troops in there to take over parts of other countries because they have something you want, or because they might pose a economic competition to you. It's not okay it's still not okay to do that. It'd be like, I don't know, the United States saying that, well, a lot of people are, coming across our southern border illegally, and Mexico's not doing anything about it. So we're just going to annex Mexico, or we're just going to carpet bomb Mexico and just start shelling Tijuana. We're just gonna shell Tijuana into dust. It's not really the appropriate way to deal with that problem. Now, like I say, it wasn't just countries around Russia that Russia did that to. They moved into Syria in 2015, and they're still there. They have, as I mentioned yesterday, deliberately bombed hospital, schools, residential areas. I've been there personally and seen it happening. They've used banned chemical weapons such as chlorine in Syria. A lot of people don't know that. In Aleppo and Idlib, which are Sunni areas, their airstrikes caused mass civilian casualties. I myself have treated wounded Syrians who were wounded by Russian artillery down in Deir ez-Zor. Horrific wounds. I held a 10-day-old baby in my arms as it died because its mother was shot in the chest and could no longer feed it. Those kinds of things stick with you. Now, all of that brings us to the invasion of Ukraine, of course, which has been going on for the last 3 years. We've seen massacre after massacre in places like Irpin and Bucha and Mariupol. If you are not familiar with the term filtration camps, these are concentration camps, essentially, that Russia set up. They still exist right now, today, as we speak. There are concentration camps in Ukraine and Russia. The Russians go through the cities that they control in Ukraine. They round up all the adult men and any adult woman that they seem interested in. They strip them down naked to check them for any kind of tattoos they might have on their body. If they find any kind of tattoo that has anything that they might interpret as being pro-Ukrainian or anti-Russian or Celtic, there's a lot of, they're into that kind of stuff over there because they descend from the Vikings. And so they're into, Viking imagery a lot over there. And so there's a lot of that sort of Celtic imagery and Viking imagery. If they find anything like that on the people, then they send them off to one of these filtration camps. Many of them die there. There's a lot of torture, rape, uh, put it all under the rubric of war crimes or crimes against humanity that are happening in these occupied regions. We know that's the case because there are plenty of outlets that have provided proof from people who have escaped from those areas, from areas that have been re-liberated by Ukraine, and from aerial imagery and things like that that show mass graves and these concentration camps. Russia very often uses cluster munitions on civilian areas. These are things that are considered to be war crimes. There's even videos out of the torture and things that they have perpetrated. I made a whole documentary about that, which won awards a couple years ago. So it's not just the military aggression that makes Russia a mafia state. It's also the political repression and assassinations that they engage in all around the world of anybody who opposes them. So you could go down the list. You've probably heard of Sergei Magnitsky. If not, you need to go read the book called Red Notice by Bill Browder. As a matter of fact, I put a link to that book in the description of this video, and you should definitely read that book. It's hard to imagine a book that is more like a Hollywood thriller, but it's real life. Bill Browder was a money manager who moved to Russia, Moscow, shortly after the fall of the Soviet Union. And, they had taken all the factories and state-owned enterprises, and they had commoditized them into like shares of stock and then handed them out to the people as an attempt to try to transfer ownership from the state to the people of these enterprises. The problem was people in Russia, after 70 years of communism, had no earthly idea what to do with stock. They're like, I can't eat this. And nobody's telling me to go to work anymore. And there's nobody in charge anymore. So nobody would go to work and all these factories just closed. So this piece of paper they got that said they had fractional ownership in whatever factory they used to work at was worthless to them. But there were some people who were ambitious, smart, educated, who realized, well, since these people don't have any idea what this stuff is worth, they will sell it for a song, next to nothing. And they went around and they bought up all the shares of that stock for pennies on the dollar, and ended up being the owners of these formerly state-owned enterprises, like the gas fields and the oil fields and the factories and the farms and all this stuff. Bill Browder was a money manager from the United States that went over there and realized, man, there is a huge upside potential here, because there's this oil field, for example, that by any measure is worth billions of dollars, and I can pick it up for $100,000 by going to the stock market in downtown Moscow and just paying people for their stock who want to, make enough money for some groceries or whatever. And he amassed a $4 billion fortune doing that, not his own money, but managing money for other people, for investors. Bill Browder he's a British citizen, so he would go back and forth to London, and it was no big deal during the 80s and 90s. I'm sorry, not the 80s, during the 90s and early 2000s. It was a Wild West kind of atmosphere in Russia, because when you go from the government controls every aspect of your life to there is no government controlling really anything, it went from it, whereas the United States, our culture is founded on the golden rule, do unto others as you would have them do unto you. Russia's new culture after the fall of the Soviet Union was the mirror image of that. It was do unto others before they do unto you. Take from others before they take from you. Steal from others before they can steal from you. Kill others before they have a chance to kill you. That was the prevailing sentiment in the culture of the post-Soviet Russia. And in that culture, it turned out, yes, there were some serious upsides. There's some incredible ways to make money, but because the government was that under Vladimir Putin that came to be was every bit as corrupt as the previous Soviet government had been, and actually had a lot fewer guardrails put on it legislatively. What they did to Bill Browder was they waited until he went to London to visit his family one time, and then they canceled his visa. He went to return to Moscow, and they said, "Sorry, you can't go to Russia anymore." And he's like, "What?" I mean, he'd been living there for like 10 years. It's just out of the blue. And so and then when he couldn't come back, the police showed up and took every computer out of his office, threatened and intimidated the office workers. But he still thought, okay, we got some tax problems or something. We can figure this out. We'll, deal with it. And he put his lawyers on it and everything, trying to get that problem fixed. And as it turned out, I'm giving away a little bit at the end of this book, but I still recommend you read it. It's an amazing book. Putin had some of his cronies go into the registry of businesses in Moscow and change the name of the owner of Bill Browder's business to some other company that belonged to one of Putin's friends, just like that. Which all of a sudden meant Bill Browder no longer owned his company. He had $4 billion in cash sitting in accounts in Russia. At the last moment, he was able to just miraculously wire out that $4 billion and get it out of there, thankfully. But they still lost all sorts of stuff. And that wasn't even what these cronies of Putin were after necessarily. What they did was once they owned the company, they went back and refiled the tax returns for the previous 7 years and made up billions of dollars worth of additional write-offs and said, oh, we made a mistake on our taxes for the last 7 years. We had all these other write-offs worth billions of dollars. I mean, what billions? It was like $200 million. And refiled their taxes and got a refund from the government of Russia for $200 million, which was completely fraudulent. And then blamed it on Browder. Bill Browder said, oh, it was all Bill Browder's fault. So Bill Browder then became like persona non grata in Russia. Well, one of his employees was a guy named Sergei Magnitsky. And he was a lawyer working for Bill Browder and was doing his best to expose what was going on. Well, that was his big mistake. They put him in prison. He was in prison for years, and eventually he was tortured to death in prison. To this day, Bill Browder goes around the world in the name of Sergei Magnitsky, trying to get laws passed. There's a Magnitsky law in the United States that forbids the U.S. federal government from doing business with the Russian oligarchies or with the Russian government. puts sanctions on Russian officials who were responsible for Magnitsky's arrest and death. There have been at least 3 state-sponsored poisonings by Russia in the last 10 years. 20 years. 2006, 2018, and 2020. The most recent one was Alexei Navalny. You may have heard his name. He was poisoned with Novichok, which is I don't know, is that very bad radioactive poison, I believe. And then later imprisoned and died in prison. Russia has, inside its own country, conducted mass arrests of protesters, anybody who opposed Putin in any way. They have, there have been a spate of high-profile suicides, quote unquote, that have taken place in Russia. It's amazing. A guy comes out and says something negative towards Vladimir Putin, and in a very short period of time, he just decides to commit suicide. There was this guy that owned the Wagner Group, was a former chef for Vladimir Putin, who had gotten very, 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 very wealthy. Not sure how that happened. Being a chef, typically chefs don't make that much money, but this guy became a billionaire as a chef for Putin. We'll talk more about how that happened in a minute. And when he started to criticize the way that the war was being run in Ukraine, he just amazingly crashed in his private jet one day on his way back to Moscow. Man, it's amazing how that happened. A lot of those guys, oligarchs who have spoken out against Putin, have ended up committing suicide by jumping out of 8th floor windows, committing suicide with 3 shots to the back of their head, stuff like that. They have criminalized free speech in Russia. It never ceases to amaze me how many people in context of the war in Ukraine talk about Russia as if it's this bastion of freedom, that Russia's a place where family values reign supreme. Yeah, because they murder anybody who's gay or imprison them. And I mean, I'm all for family values, but not that kind of family values. We're not in the business, we shouldn't be in the business of, just killing people we disagree with. But that's how it's done in Russia. So, when you see people on social media who are like, oh, Ukraine's really the bad guys here, I'm like, what, really? Russia's not the bad guy? Russia's lily white, justified in everything they've done? Really? Poisoning people with Novichok? Concentration camps right now? I saw a photograph after Irpin was liberated, right near Kyiv at the beginning of the war, of an apartment they found that had, I think, 28 bodies in it, all young girls. All of them had been horribly raped, as young as 4. You justify that how? So it kind of makes me sick, especially when I hear American Christian conservatives who have never been to Ukraine, probably would have a hard time finding it on a map, spouting these talking points that they have been had drilled into their head through social media, most of which came straight from Russia, Russian propaganda. acting like they are experts on the subject. Zelensky's buying yachts and villas all over the world. None of that's true. Simply because they cannot bring themselves to agree that something ought to be done to take Russia down a notch, at the very least, because it was first, that was being done under the Biden administration. And well, we can't agree with Joe Biden on anything. I think that's a extremely short-sighted thing. And as I have mentioned, it is my policy that I'm going to approach each conflict from the standpoint of right and wrong. I'm going to approach each conflict from the standpoint of who is hurting innocent people unjustly. There is a case to be made for the righteous employment of violence. And sometimes that violence, unfortunately, encompasses civilians, people who are not directly involved. That's a tragedy. But the tragedy, the culpability for that tragedy always lies at the feet of the aggressor. In the case of Israel, the aggressor obviously was Hamas because there was a ceasefire on October 6th, 2023. Carolyn Shelton says, how is it not true about Zelensky buying luxury items? Well, Zelensky was a wealthy man before he became president. He was voted in as president as a Trump-like figure who was not a politician. They wanted him there because he had he was an actor like, I don't know, Ronald Reagan or Donald Trump. Both of them have acted in movies and TV shows. And he was brought in to get rid of the corruption in the government and the culture in Ukraine. He's taken a lot of steps to do that. I could just go, point by point and explain that, how that's happened. But suffice it to say that the accusations that Zelensky has been buying luxury vehicles and villas and yachts around the world is just outright false. There's no proof of that whatsoever. If you go do a search for it, do a Google search, you'll find people claiming it, but you'll never find proof. Galacio Guevara says, I'd love to see you go to Russia and talk to Vladimir Putin, similarly like Tucker Carlson. The problem is, if I was to go to Russia and to talk to Vladimir Putin, I would not return, because Vladimir Putin does not broker any kind of, for me. I have been to Russia twice. I've been to Moscow. And this is one way it's an easy way to tell who's probably on the right side of any conflict, is figure out which side you're actually allowed to report about. There are some journalists in Russia who have said, very pointedly, when Russia does something wrong, they've pointed it out. Those people typically lose their jobs and go to jail. There's a long list of journalists who have been jailed in Russia for that. Tucker Carlson had to agree to sit and smile and nod for Vladimir Putin for his entire interview. If you go back and watch the interview that Tucker did with Putin, Tucker can hardly get a word in edgewise. Putin just rambles on about the history of the region, and he wasn't really allowed to ask any difficult questions. Go back and watch it. You'll see what I mean. If Tucker had not been already spouting the party line from Russian propaganda before he went to Russia, he would have never been allowed to go to Russia. I met a journalist in Armenia, I'd say journalist kind of loosely, named Patrick Lancaster, who later went on, he lives in the Donbass region, and he's still reporting out of Russia even now. He's had great access to frontline units and places in the war. He has been present, they've proven, when Ukrainian POWs have been brutally murdered, castrated, things like that. His own videos prove it. And he's never once said anything about any of those things being wrong or that they shouldn't have happened. Now, there was a point when I was in Ukraine and a video came out of a Ukrainian unit that had captured some Russian soldiers, and they were very angry because those Russian soldiers had just killed some of their buddies. And so these Ukrainian soldiers went over and shot the Russians in the knees, in the kneecaps. And I immediately went on TV and called it out and said that that's a war crime, and those guys should be arrested and prosecuted. I did that from Ukraine. I criticized the Ukrainian military. And you know what they did? They arrested those guys and prosecuted them. And they didn't do anything at all to me. I have many times challenged Patrick Lancaster to do the same. Just say one thing negative about what Russia is doing. Point out one time where they've killed civilians. Anything. And he won't, because he would disappear. And that's one way you can know who's on the right side of this. Somebody, Mookow says, why can't I chat in the chat as you're chatting? Saying you can't chat. That's awesome. Let's move on to human rights abuses by Russia. Not only, as I mentioned, they have suppressed rights of homosexuals, even to the point of torturing them, purging them, things like that. They have engaged in absolutely, if you think the aggression that Russia has fomented against its neighbors is bad, that's a drop in the bucket to the aggression that they have perpetrated against the rest of the world in terms of cyber attacks, cyber crime coming out of Russia with the full knowledge and support of the Russian government. As I mentioned, I read a book a couple weeks ago on that subject that would blow your mind. I mean, in last year alone, $9 trillion was lost or stolen by cyber hackers around the world. $9 trillion. And much of that, I would say the majority of it, came out of Russia. Russia sees their hackers as an arm of their government, an arm of their military. They have committed heinous cyber attacks against Ukraine, Estonia. There was a cyber attack in Ukraine that to this day I think it was 2014 when that happened. To this day, people will tell you where they were. It's one of those events, that you have a few times in your life, like 9/11, where people can tell you right where they were and what they were doing when it happened, because it was so devastating to the economy and to the culture, to the society in Ukraine. And that cyber attack came directly from Russia. They are engaged right now in massive disinformation and misinformation all across the internet. That's why many of you have been affected by that misinformation. And that's one of the reasons why I'm doing this podcast. It's not popular, believe it or not. I mean, you can tell just by the numbers here. We've got 886 people online. Please go hit the like button, by the way, if you haven't already. Normally, when I do these lives, we have up to 3,000 people online. This is, but I always know that if I decide to do a live about anything that has to do with Russia and Ukraine, you can just hear people's computers shutting off all over the country, because people are tired of it. People have very negative sentiments against Ukraine, mostly because of Russian propaganda. When you go back to when the war started in February 2022, it wasn't like that. Most people around the world saw it for what it was. This is an aggression by Russia. It's wrong. They do not have the right to kick in the door and take their neighbor's country. And they understood that. And the world flooded Ukraine with humanitarian aid and help. But then Russia kicked their cyber war into high gear, information warfare against you, not against Ukraine, against you, and was able to actually change the narrative and make people, oh, wait a minute. Ukraine is actually the bad guy here. All that stuff you've heard about Ukraine online, vast majority of it has been untrue. Now, let's move on. I mean, there's a whole lot more actually we can do to this. The Russian president now, all of this is leading to what I'm about to say. The Trump administration is attempting to broker a ceasefire in the war between Ukraine and Russia. Ukraine immediately said, we'll agree to a 30-day ceasefire, no strings attached. For somebody that President Trump accused of not wanting peace, that sounds a whole lot like wanting peace. So they propose a 30-day ceasefire. Russia at first just rejected it out of hand, and then came back, and when that didn't look so good in the press, said, no, we agree to a 30-day ceasefire on the following conditions. And these conditions are Ukraine loses. I mean, basically, let's outline what they are. Ukraine has to recognize Russia's ownership of the regions that they've annexed and some regions that they haven't annexed, like Zaporizhia and Kherson. They have to withdraw all Ukrainian troops from the front lines. They have to agree to never become a member of NATO. They have to have limitations on their military capabilities forever. There have to be protections in writing in law for Russian-speaking populations. There already are. That's one that is ridiculous. And there have to be new elections in Ukraine just for a 30-day ceasefire. In order to agree to a 30-day ceasefire, what Russian President Vladimir Putin is saying is, you have to give me everything that I've been fighting for the last 3 years. Many analysts obviously are kind of rolling their eyes at that, because this is an agreement by it's like, yeah, I'll agree to buy that car as long as I don't have to pay for it. Yeah, sure, I'll agree to move as long as I don't have to move. Whatever. Yeah, I'll agree to quit fighting as long as my opponent agrees to die. That's essentially what the agreement is here. Now, why wouldn't Putin want a ceasefire right now? Putin's the cost to Russia has been staggering, absolutely staggering for this war. Last year alone, they had more than 434,000 casualties on the Russian side. And hi, honey, I'm right in the middle of a live. My wife's calling me. She forgot I was on a live. Russia had 434,000 casualties last year. Not just dead, but dead and wounded. They're losing upwards of 100 men per kilometer that they've taken. If you add up the number of days they've been fighting and add up the amount of distance that they have accomplished to take over inside Ukraine over what they already controlled at the beginning of the war, somebody pointed out the other day that they're moving at about half the speed of your common garden slug. A garden snail moves about 0.72 miles a week, something like that. Russia has moved about half that on average in terms of taking land. So they are taking over land now. I mean, they are making gains. They are, making progress, slow, but at a very, very high cost. So because they're currently making gains, Putin might not be as motivated to, uh, come to the negotiating table. But part of the reason that they're making those gains is because the United States had shut off military aid to Ukraine. Guess what? That's been turned back on now. So wait, you might go, what? Did you know? So many people expected that President Trump would immediately just cut off all aid to Ukraine. That'd be it. But he turned it back on. Did you know that the Trump administration, the first Trump administration, sent all sorts of weapons to Ukraine? The Javelin missiles that enabled Ukraine to hold off the initial Russian advance. That was also President Trump. Those were sent by Trump. So with the ammunition being turned back on, we have an issue. That might bring Russia to the table. All right, folks, I'm sorry, I've got to run. I've got another interview in 1 minute. But thank you for watching the Hot Zone. I appreciate all of you. Please like